Welcome to each of you from the Canby Church of Christ, if you're a visitor with us. We're a place where families build eternal homes. And I hope that's something that you're really serious about in your own life as well. You know, no amount of personal or professional success will make up for failure in the home. If you're married, your marriage and family should be second only to God. And researchers have determined that it is a key factor in your personal well-being and in your satisfaction in your life. I marvel that when you read some of the early literature of the first, second, third centuries, how the Roman pagan philosophers would often rail against the early Christians, complain about how they would isolate themselves from society and not go to the Colosseum where there was so much violence, wouldn't participate in the theaters, which were quite promiscuous. And they would, talk about the whole idea of the resurrection as just being folly. But then they frequently would stop and sort of reluctantly say, oh, but what loving marriages and families they have. I wonder, are the marriages and families in the church so exemplary that even our critics have to stop and admit that we're exemplary in that area? I just really think we can do a lot better than what we've been doing. Amen? And that is my goal, that we can actually be known for having close and rich and meaningful family relationships that truly build eternal homes. And so we're talking today about a marriage that works, and as I introduced in the Bible class, this formula is really not that difficult. Both parties need to learn to develop habits that will show care. In other words, you understand each other's needs, value them, because you love these other people, so you value what they value. So you learn to care for your spouse and to protect them, which is another way of saying avoid things that are going to offend them or hurt them in practical ways. And so we passed out in the Bible class, and I hope that everybody will go home with one of these nice professionally typeset kind of marriage primers. I call it Key Concepts That Make a Marriage Work. And we're right now in the middle of a three-part series. In just a few moments, we're going to be looking at, it doesn't look like there's a page number on the bottom of that one. What would be page number 9, Rating Your Love Busters, and page number 8 explains about the Love Busters. But this is a three-part series. We introduced in Bible class some important fundamental information. And then today we're going to be looking at overcoming love busters. And then at 1 o'clock, know that you don't used to come back, but at 1 o'clock we're going to be talking about the final installment, meeting each other's needs. By the way, all of this material is available for download off the Canby Church of Christ website. So if you'd like to get a copy and you'd like to forward that on to others, please feel free. None of this material is copyrighted. I just want to have this out to help folks who may benefit from the material. Those of you that were in Bible class know that we introduced the concept of the love bank, which is the key to passion, that we all have this emotional love bank within us. And particularly in a marriage, we need to make sure that we make as many deposits as possible and avoid making withdrawals. And we talked about the romantic myth, discussed the importance of habits, and introduced the concept of love busters. And throughout this series, I've been taking us back to what our scripture reading was read by Brother Gary about how we keep love alive by obviously maintaining the love of 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 8, which is this beautiful sort of rainbow color of love. Today we're going to look at an explanation of what Willard Harley refers to as love busters, where you protect your marriage by replacing love-busting patterns with love-building habits. That may sound like a tall order, but it's really not that difficult once you understand what we're dealing with and have good communication. And so everybody that's married, when we're done, I hope you'll go to that page in the handout and rate your spouse's love busters and talk about this. And then have a plan to overcome love busters so that you can have a really rich and vibrant and passionate marriage, which is in the grasp of all of us. So how do we define a love buster? Well, according to Dr. Harley, it is a destructive marital habit, which is a repeated behavior of a spouse that causes the other to be happy or to withdraw love units from the love bank. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood. Everybody at times inadvertently hurts their spouse, frustrates them, annoys them. Welcome to the human race, right? We're all just imperfect, fallible human beings. And hopefully we can give each other grace for occasionally kind of messing up here and there. But we're talking here not about something that is a rare occasion. We're talking here about a habitual pattern that sort of dogs your steps and that you learn to live in fear or dread of this behavior being repeated. Imagine being married to a drunk and you have to deal with that, and his behavior is a mad drunk when he comes in from one of his or her drunken binges. That's the kind of thing. Talk about a love buster and a major withdrawal from the love bank. Dr. Harley says, when negative acts are repeatable and predictable, love suffers great loss. So we want to avoid love busters. One of the worst love busters, and I run across this a lot in my counseling, is angry outburst. And this is where someone kind of gets their fuse lit and they use it as a way to punish or to get back at their spouse. These are moments where the person is really harsh. And what it does is it creates disrespect between the parties. And you especially want to avoid, oftentimes when you're angry, you also yell. Angry, yelling, loud outbursts are degrading, they're threatening, and they're something that you need to make sure that you just alleviate from the way you interact with each other in the family. I think a good Bible example of an angry outburst is Job's wife. I mean, we think about Job, who lost his children and his friends and his treasure and his health, and how awful it must have been to, at the very end, also lost the support of his wife at the time that he needed support most. So this is not going to be this woman's finest hour. In fact, this is what she's known for. But we need to be careful not to be too hard on her, because she also lost her children and her friends and her treasure and at least the health of her husband. So she'd gone through a lot until she just finally lost it. And she says, why don't you just curse God and die? I mean, that's the last thing poor Job wanted to hear from his wife. He should have been rushing to his aid instead of just saying, just give it up. And we don't know the tone of voice or whatever that Job's wife said this in, but I can imagine she was pretty much filled with anguish and anger. And this is a great example, I think, of an angry outburst that she's going to wish she hadn't said, right? And that's what we want to avoid, saying things that later on we look back with regret. So no wonder the Bible is so filled with admonitions about this kind of thing. James 1, be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to just react, and slow to wrath. Proverbs 14:17. He who is quick-tempered acts foolishly. And there is one who speaks like the piercing of a sword, but the tongue of the wise provides healing. So I like to say, choose your words carefully, for you may later have to eat them, right? Most of the time, this is just a bad habit, and it usually has been picked up from bad parenting, and now you're just passing it on. So you just decide, I'm not going to do that anymore. And you're going to prayerfully work on establishing a new habit where you are swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. If someone frequently loses it, I'm dealing with a couple right now where the man was abused by his father, and so now he's very emotionally abusive toward his wife. And it's difficult for him to overcome that when he gets triggered. And he's doing pretty good. I'm working with him on it. He went to anger management. But his wife just shut down because he gets upset and curses at her and all this kind of stuff, and then claims like, oh, words don't mean anything. I didn't mean it. And is actually accused her of being a weak person for not just accepting him as he is and taking this so personally. I mean, that is just bizarre. I said, no, she's a strong person. She's standing up to this abuse. You ought to be thankful she's not putting up with this garbage. So, angry outburst destroyed many a marriage. Secondly, is disrespectful judgments. This is also very common, but more subtle. No one likes to be around a caustic critic. Dr. John Lung has an excellent book. It's one of my favorites. It's called How to Avoid Physical Divorce by Avoiding Emotional Divorce. And he says that the reason why people decide to divorce physically is because before that they become divorced emotionally and spiritually. He's right about that. So one of the pages in your primer, don't look for it now, but look for it later, is how to avoid spiritual divorce. And it's some questionnaires and all that you and your spouse can read through to try to get rid of any walls, because that's your biggest enemy, is walls over time that develop between the two of you. And the reason why walls develop is because eventually somebody decides they need to put up a wall to protect themselves from the very spouse who at the altar promised to love, honor, and cherish. Isn't that ironic? Protect yourself from your spouse who should be protecting you. A disrespectful judgment is where you impose your values on the other person in a way that is rude and arrogant and disrespectful. If you had any taste, you'd understand that that tie doesn't match that shirt and jacket. If you were normal, you'd understand that's not the way people squeeze toothpaste. If it wasn't for your mother, you wouldn't feel that way and act the way you do. I'm telling you what, when you start criticizing somebody else's mother, those are fighting words, right? I mean, these are disrespectful judgments. I'm not saying we can't make judgments. James 4 talks about who are you to judge, and there's a sense in which only God is the judge. But Jesus also said that we should, in John 7, verse 24, judge righteous judgments. And we need to do so in tactful and respectful ways. Sadly, partially because of the lack of civility in our public discourse these days, people are modeling the wrong kind of dialogue when you have honest differences. I'll just tell you, one of the things that just breaks my heart is how if your political opponent disagrees with you, there are some who immediately pull out the race card and accuse you of being a racist or a bigot. Oh, that's one of the worst things you can call someone is a racist, a terrible sin. And so it kind of shuts down the conversation. And my question is, do you know that person's heart? How do you know they're really a racist? And they keep on redefining what is and what isn't racist. It's all just awful, disrespectful judgments and put-downs. It doesn't encourage a meaningful dialogue. In a good marriage, you work on respectful persuasion and you try to avoid put-downs. How much better to say, honey, do you think maybe this tie would look better than the one you selected? I mean, nobody gets offended at that. But to say, if you had any taste, you'd see that that doesn't match. Whoa, talk about pushing away your spouse. You need to make sure that you talk to one another in a marriage as an adult would speak to another adult, and not speak to your spouse as if they're a child or to treat them like they're one of the kids. No, you're both adults. Be respectful of each other as you discuss your differences. The next is a little bit more humorous, but I think can be a real issue as far as making withdrawals from the love bank. And this is annoying behaviors. Doing something that irritates the other party consistently. And the Bible talks about this. Proverbs 27:14. If someone blesses his friend with a loud voice early in the morning, it will be taken as a curse. So, if you happen to be a morning dove and you're married to a night owl that wants to sleep in and you come in, hey, good morning to you, roll that beautiful bean, and you're going, ugh. It's kind of annoying, isn't it? I thought this was a cute little meme. Do I look like I do mornings? A lot of times I get big amens on that one. But at any rate, the point is that, if that's annoying to your spouse, if they're trying to sleep and you just completely are inconsiderate of the fact that that's the situation they're in. Even Solomon, 3,000 years ago, was warning about that. In fact, the King James says that if you arise this early with a loud voice, it is likened unto smoke in the eyes and vinegar in the eyes. Vinegar in the eyes? Ooh. In other words, boy, this is really irritating. So if you love somebody, you don't want to irritate them, even if they're just sort of these innocent habits. It's doing something that irritates the other party consistently. Now, one thing I find really fascinating, and the literature is really consistent on this, is that women tend to find men more annoying than men find women. You think so, Justin? Yeah, well, it's really interesting that when you discuss this, like in a marriage seminar format, the women will raise their hand and they'll say, well, that's because men are more annoying than women. And the men will typically say, no, that's just because we men are much more tolerant and understanding than women are. And you know what? I'm not going to even weigh in on that discussion or that battle here in this mixed audience. But it is true that when you talk about love busters, most of the time women will list ways their husbands annoy them, where rarely do men have a list on their part with their wives. Now, there sometimes are. But this is really true. And a lot of times men will say, well, you shouldn't be bothered by that. Remember one guy telling me, I sometimes fall asleep on the couch, and sometimes I fall asleep, and then I'm told that I kind of let my mouth go wide open, and I'm snoring, and my wife walks in, and she sees me with my mouth open, snoring on the couch, and she says, that is so annoying. And she goes, the guy goes, do you mean I'm laying there taking a nap, and I'm making withdrawals from the love bank? I go, yes, you are. And maybe you ought to sleep upstairs and close the door so you don't annoy your wife, because I imagine that's not a very pretty picture. And so a lot of times people say, well, you just don't be annoyed by that. Listen, most of these things are ways in which we're sort of hardwired. It's just not that easy to change something that annoys you. It's easier for the person that's involved in the annoying behavior to just make that a commitment to not do that, to try to avoid that habit. My wife, after years of marriage, told me some things I did that annoyed her. I didn't even know. So again, ladies, let your husband know. Communicate. Wasn't my fault if I didn't know. And some of those were fairly easy to rectify. The idea here is making a commitment to be considerate. We're talking about things like maybe one spouse, it's really important to be punctual, and the other spouse is always running late and embarrassing them as a result. Or maybe it's eating with your mouth open and not having good table manners, or poor posture, or fretting and tapping your fingers. And so, you fill in the blank. Everybody's got certain things that may annoy the other party, and it is worth bringing up because over time it does damage to the love bank. So, annoying behaviors is one love buster. Next is selfish demands. Demands choke out love. And the Bible over and over again tells the husband to agape his wife. And the idea there is be selfless in your love towards your wife. That's the idea of agape. So when you sacrifice for your spouse, the other person appreciates that. They feel love. But when you make demands, especially if you feel like it's a selfish demand, without concern for her or him, then that chokes out love. You can have a slave or a lover, but you can't have both. Threats, lectures, manipulation, ultimatums, that builds resentment and causes the other party discomfort. Commanding your spouse to do things that benefit you at your spouse's expense with implied threat of punishment if you don't go along is a major love buster. And so the Bible warns us all the time about being considerate of others and not being involved in selfish demands. I think probably the best Bible example I can think of this is Delilah pressuring Samson daily until his soul was vexed. I have a sermon I preach on Samson called Strong But Stupid. And, after Delilah revealed what she was up to, I can't believe he let her stick around. I mean, she was obviously out to betray him. And she didn't care at all about Samson. She just wanted him ultimately to be delivered up to her people so she could get the money they were offering her. Talk about selfish. The Bible says in Philippians 2, let nothing be done through selfish ambition, but let each of you look out not only for your own interest, but also for the interest of others. See, this is just a generic statement about how you treat other people, but especially this applies in marriage. And before you make a major decision, ask how the other party would feel before moving forward. I know of a preacher friend who got a phone call and made some negotiations with a church 1,000 miles away from their home and decided, yeah, I'll take this job, let's move. And so he just came downstairs and just announced to his wife that they were moving out of state. Didn't even talk to her about it first. Are you kidding me? You don't think that impacts her, where she lives, and the congregation they work with? How selfish to not even consider her thoughts about that before you make the final call. So selfish demands is a major withdrawal from the love bank. And of course, I find dishonesty interesting because it's one of the main needs that we're going to talk about in our third session that people have is a need for open and honesty. But dishonesty is also a huge love buster. And the reason why this is so serious is because if your spouse catches you lying to them, even once, now everything you say in the future has a big question mark over its head. Well, is he telling me the truth, or is she telling me the truth, or not? So even if you're going to take the heat for owning up to something you did, it's better to take the heat and be honest than to cover it up and then later on you're discovered. Because dishonesty breaks down trust. Big time. And who wants to live with a liar? The key here is to reveal to your spouse your thoughts, feelings, habits, likes, dislikes, personal history, daily activities, and plans for the future that he or she has the right to know. True story. About 30 years ago, some friends of ours dated and married, and we were encouraged that they were dating, and we were at their wedding, and all looked like it was going to go really well, until the wife, a week after they come home from the honeymoon, is just in tears. The honeymoon didn't go well. And the reason is this woman told me that her husband announced to her on their wedding night that he didn't want to have children. And she had just assumed that they were going to have children. Usually, when you get married, you assume that you're going to have a family. And she said, What? Why didn't you tell me? And he said, because I was afraid if I told you, you wouldn't marry me. So he springs it on them on their wedding. Talk about spoiled. And the gentleman defended himself because he said, now, I never lied to you about this. I just avoided the subject. And so because he didn't specifically tell a non-truth about this, he felt like he was okay. But given the assumption about the fact that that's a pretty important topic that would certainly involve your spouse, big time, he was dishonest to her because he kept something from her that she had the right to know, right? So that can be a way to be dishonest also. The Bible is filled with examples of this. The Bible says that Jacob deceived his father Isaac in the darkness of his blindness. And I think it's ironic that later on, Jacob is going to be deceived by Laban in the darkness of the wedding tent when he gets the woman he hadn't bargained for. I guess what goes around comes around. Remember, deception is the primary role of Satan. That's what he is. He's the deceiver. He's dishonest. And you're playing into the very role of Satan himself and doing his bidding when you lie and you deceive. I think you guys just had a series on Satan's lies, right? Dishonesty, therefore, putting away lying, each one. Speak truth one to another. Colossians 3, 9 and 10. Do not lie to one another. Liars inherit the lake of fire, Revelation 21 and verse 8. And one of the things that we had our kids memorize that I recommend that parents do, and we all lay up on our heart, lying is an abomination to Jehovah, but those who deal truthfully are his delight. And so we need to teach our kids. It's better that you fess up and you be honest about what you did than it is to lie about it and try to cover up because you don't want to be punished. And I recommend that parents sort of maybe are a little lighter on the punishment if they were honest about it, to try to help them to understand that honesty is always the best policy. And then there's something known as independent behavior. This is defined as the conduct of one spouse that is conceived and executed as if the other spouse did not even exist. That's what the preacher did when he just came downstairs and announced we're moving. Now, I'm not talking about unhealthy dependency here. I mean, nobody wants to have a clinging vine kind of a relationship where you don't have any way to breathe. Obviously, Gibran was correct when he talked about, as a lute with two strings apart, yet vibrating complementary tones. Let there be spaces in your togetherness. Beautiful poetic language. And let the winds of the heavens dance between you. There's some individuality, obviously, and some space you need to give each other. But making major financial decisions that impact your spouse without consulting them is a form of what they refer to as financial infidelity. And a lot of marriages find that that's a problem. And when the spouse finds the other spouse has done certain things without their knowledge or permission, they feel betrayed, and rightfully so. The key is interdependent behavior where the partners nurture and protect each other and consider their feelings. This is the opposite of a cooperative partnership. It's more like a sole proprietorship. Remember, there are no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man put asunder. So here are the love busters that make big withdrawals from the love bank. Punch holes in your love bucket, so to speak. Angry outburst, disrespectful judgments, annoying behavior, selfish demands, dishonesty, and independent behavior. That is the enemy of your romantic love. And when these are unchecked, romantic love is always the victim. And the thing folks need to understand is when the love busters continue to push holes in your love bucket, love deposits will not be received or held, because if you're filled with angry outbursts and dishonesty and all these different things, you're not even wanting to hear I love you. You're not even wanting to receive flowers. Yeah, all those different things, it's like, So be careful. First thing you have to do, if you're going to save a marriage or improve it, is to stop the love busters. That comes first. Because, again, if you're trying to pour water into a bucket with holes in it, you're never going to fill up the bucket until you plug up the holes. And be careful, a few major withdrawals can undo scores of prior deposits. So, there's, on this page of your handout, a way that you can go home and rate each other's love busters. And here's 6 tips to overcome. Be committed to overcoming these love busters, and yet have patience, because these things take time. And don't overwhelm your spouse with like 3 love busters at once. Do one at a time. Pick the one that's most important to you to stop, and let them work on that. And try to identify the why. Why is this such a problem? And avoid triggers that might bring these things about, or maybe trigger anger or whatever. And if possible, develop alternative behaviors. I call these righteous substitutes. So maybe somebody's constantly going like this and it drives their spouse crazy. Maybe they can just buy one of those stress balls. And instead of going like this, just squeeze the ball, and all of a sudden the constant drumming stops. Some of these solutions are pretty simple. Some of them take a little bit more creativity. But then you ask your mate for an evaluation weekly. Don't nag the person about it, but say, okay, honey, how am I doing? And then talk about it and pray about this together, privately and together. That is the key. You must communicate clearly without being defensive. Rate them on the form. And then each spouse really needs to listen so they can develop new habits, so they can learn to care and protect each other in practical ways, so they will be part of a marriage that really works. And they'll have a love bucket where any holes are plugged, because you're conscientious about getting rid of these unhealthy, negative behaviors. So, no amount of personal or professional success will make up for failure in the home. Now, wouldn't it be great if all of us developed just these rich, passionate, healthy marriages and families, so that other people look at us and say, you know, I may not agree with you and some of your doctrine. I'm not really sure baptism is for the remission of sins, but you know what? I sure respect and appreciate the families that make up the Canby Church of Christ. Wouldn't that be a great testimony to the glory of God? That's my prayer, and that's my hope for each of you. Let us remember that Jesus is our bridegroom, faithful and true. He's right now knocking at your heart door. You're ready to come. The directions to heaven are simple. You turn to the right and you go straight. Anybody ready? If so, won't you come as together we stand and we sing.